Test one, two. Test one, two. Testing one, two. Testing wireless mic D. Testing one, two. Test one, two. Test one, two. Testing one, two. Testing wireless mic D. Testing one, two. Test one two. Test one two. Testing one two. Testing wireless mic D. Testing one two. Test one two. Test one two. Testing one two. Testing wireless mic D. Testing one two. Test one two. Test one two. Testing one two. Testing wireless mic D. Testing one two. Test one two. Test one two. Testing one two. Testing wireless mic D. Testing one two. Test one two. Test one two. Testing one two. Testing wireless mic D. Testing one two. Test one two. Test one two. Testing one two. Wireless mic D. Testing one two.
For folks who are just coming in, there's still seats up front here. You can sit in the jury box. Um, Come on down. For folks who are just coming in, there's still seats up front here. You can sit in the jury box. Um, Come on. Let's try to move through the food line quickly. I'm not sure if there's room to make another row on the other side or if it's too tight. Um, Also, in case we do get filled to capacity, there is an overflow room in A58, which is on over there on the other side of this, around to the left. Okay, we're going to get started. I know folks are still getting food and settling down. There are still seats up front. You're also welcome to fill the jury box down up front over here. I am going to turn this over. Right now, I want to thank Dr. Marilyn Mobley for being here. She is the university's Vice President of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity, and we're so pleased she made time in her busy schedule to welcome all of you here today. So thank you for being here.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Jesse. I'm so happy to be here this afternoon. I have a luncheon I'm supposed to attend at 12:15. But I said, I'm coming here first. And so it has been my pleasure for the past 10 years to serve as our university's Vice President for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity. I'm also an alum of our university and a member of the leadership team for the Social Justice Institute. Professor Hill and I are both on that leadership team, and I serve on the faculty of the new minor in African and African American Studies. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this very important dialogue on religious liberty and LGBT rights today. Just last evening at the Social Justice Institute engagement with the Ellipsis Institute of Color, which is the other conference that's happening, and the Cleveland YWCA, there was a film shown on the activist Wilma Mankiller. That event began with a land acknowledgement, and so I believe it might be fitting to pause here and acknowledge that Native American and other indigenous people were on this land before us, and that the labor of enslaved people from the African diaspora are also part of the history that needs to be acknowledged as well. So I'm beginning with that acknowledgement. Dialogues have been held around this country, engaging students, thought leaders, and communities on hard topics and encouraging them to think outside of their worldview. In fact, after dialogues with colleagues here at the law school, and I think Professor Adler was one of them, he may not remember this, but my office began hosting viewpoint forums to engage in meaningful dialogues about controversial issues. Moreover, our campus has received national recognition for our work as a sustained dialogue campus, where we are engaged in training faculty, students, and staff in the skills needed to facilitate dialogues, especially dialogues around difficult subjects such as the very ones we are here to discuss today. So even though I'm not going to be able to stay the whole time, I thank all of you for your participation. The dialogues seek to answer the question, is there a solution to hard issues that best serves all of our commitments? Today's hard issues, religious liberty, and the culture war over LGBT rights, can university students make a difference? I already know the answer. The answer is yes. We're pleased to bring together voices from all viewpoints and capture all angles. And I will say in our work around sustained dialogue, we do make a serious distinction between debate and dialogue. And so I'm hoping that the distinction between those two words, what is debate, what is dialogue, will be part of the discussion today. We're pleased to bring these guests to speak to us. I've been asked to remind you that anyone who tweets is going to be entered into a $250 social media engagement prize. Oh. Okay. Randomly selected. We ask that the person who receives the prize is a student. Professor Wilson will write a check for the winner at the end of our time together. Again, welcome. I look forward to being part of this dialogue and to learning more about it. I'm so glad it's being live streamed. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. In addition to Marilyn, there are a bunch of people to thank for helping make this event possible today. The student chapter of the American Constitution Society and Jessica Ice, who leads that. The student chapter of the Federalist Society and Hugh Dowell, who's the current president of that, as well as the Cleveland Arts Institute Planning Committee, the First Amendment Partnership, and the Templeton Religion Trust. Now, I'm going to introduce our first two speakers, and then Dean Hill will introduce the others, and then we will get to the substance of the program, because I know you didn't come here to listen to me. But two of the folks you came to listen to and dialogue with are Shannon Mintner and Robin Fretwell Wilson. Shannon Minter is legal director of the National Center for Lesbian Rights. Mr. Minter was lead counsel for same-sex couples in the landmark California marriage equality case, and quite a few challenges to state marriage bans in states like Alabama, Florida, Idaho, and New Mexico. And he represented married same-sex couples from Tennessee in Obergefell versus Hodges, the Supreme Court decision that held that states had to recognize same-sex couples on the same basis that they recognize opposite-sex couples. Robin Wilson is the Roger and Stephanie Jocelyn Professor of Law and Director of the Fairness for All Initiative at the University of Illinois College of Law. She founded and directs the Tolerance Means Dialogues and is editor most recently.
Oh, thank you, John.
This book, which is very much related to the topic for today, a book she co-edited with Bill Eskridge called Religious Freedom, LGBT Rights, and the Prospects for Common Ground. Dean Hill has a chapter in here. I believe Shannon has a chapter in here as well, a wide range of viewpoints in this book. And do we have flyers before the discount?
There are flyers.
There are flyers in the back of the room, which if you wanted a copy, means that you'd get a 20% discount on the book. If you're interested in these issues and understanding the full range of viewpoints on these issues that certainly consume a lot of energy and concern, this is a good place to start. And I will turn things over to Dean Hill.
Thank you, and it's my honor to introduce our two student panelists who are the winners of the Tolerance Means Dialogue essay contest. We solicited essays within a 100-mile radius of the university, so anyone who is a student, undergraduate or graduate, could submit an essay, and we actually, I learned, had the highest number of applicants or entries that the dialogues have ever had. So this was a very competitive contest, and our two winners were, first, Emma Behrens, who is the undergraduate winner. She is studying sculpture and expanded media at the Cleveland Institute of Art and is expected to graduate in 2021. And then our graduate winner is our own Kyle Jorstad, a 1L here at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. He intends to pursue coursework in the field of health law and biomedical ethics. So with that, I will turn it over to the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Hill, and thanks so much. I'm just so happy and privileged to be here. You know, there's so many issues that are dividing our country right now, and I'm grateful to be part of an intentional effort to do the opposite, to try to build bridges and reach across what seem to be apparent divides anyway. I think conversations between LGBT people and people of faith in particular are just far too rare, and that's a real problem. You know, it's so easy to make judgments about people that you don't know, and then that can so easily escalate. And I've felt this in myself before, that we start to no longer even see each other as fellow human beings. And I personally, particularly appreciate the chance to have this particular conversation, even though it can be very difficult sometimes, because I feel such a strong identification, but sometimes a conflicting one with sort of both sides of this equation. You know, I'm a transgender man. I work for an LGBT civil rights organization. I basically spent my entire professional career as a lawyer advocating for LGBT people. But at the same time, you know, I grew up in a very small, conservative farming community in Northeast Texas, and that, you know, I very much understand and respect that cultural and religious perspective. When I was a kid, you know, I went to a small Methodist church. My grandmother was my Sunday school teacher. And when I grew up living in just that strong faith community, it was incredibly important to me in ways that I didn't even fully realize at the time as a child. But it was just kind of part of the air I breathed, and it was so nurturing and sustaining to me in so many ways. It was really devastating to me when I became a teenager and I started to realize, I realized I was different. I started feeling this gulf opening up between me and my family and my faith community, and I really didn't understand at all at the time anything about what it meant to be transgender. I didn't even know that word. I was born female, and I knew I liked girls, so I assumed that I was a lesbian. And I also knew, you know, especially at that time, that was just not something that my family or my church was going to be able to accept, or really even worse, something they weren't even going to be able to talk about. So, as you can imagine, I was really confused and devastated. I just literally had no positive narrative or way to understand what it meant to be gay or transgender in that world, and neither did my parents. I think the worst part for me was feeling that I was, damned. Not just that I was now unworthy of my parents' love, but I was unworthy of God's love as well. And I really believe that. Some of you may have seen there's research now that's been out for a few years that shows that young people who are rejected by their families, and particularly when it's overlaid with a message of religious rejection too, are very high risk of depression and suicide. In fact, they're literally like 8.5 times more likely to be suicidal. In my case, that certainly was true for me, and I don't think I would have made it if it wasn't for my high school government teacher. His name was Mr. Jackson, Larry Jackson. What was really, and I think is notable about this, is that he was a very conservative Christian person, actually far more religious and far more conservative than my parents. But despite that, really, actually because of that, he was just completely supportive of me. He told me that while, based on his religious beliefs, he thought it was a sin, or believed it was a sin to be gay, that it was no more sinful than a lot of things he had done in his life, and that while I remember him telling me, while this may be a failing of me, Shannon, I just want you to know, I don't personally find the fact that you're gay in any way personally repellent or disgusting. And he made me meet with him before class every day just to be sure I was okay. And he made me promise if I ever felt suicidal, I would call him. He did all the right things. So you can see it's no wonder that I think these kind of dialogues are important, because they literally, saved my life when I was a teenager. And I've been really fortunate over the years to be able to work on issues that have led to conversations that I think have really reached across some of these divides. Definitely working on the marriage equality cases was the biggest example I've experienced, because the thing before that national conversation that happened because of that, many people, including in my family, for example, just genuinely believed a lot of very negative things about gay people. And in particular, I think one of the biggest misconceptions was the idea that gay people don't care about family or children or relationships, making long-term commitments, that kind of thing. And I think through the whole marriage equality debate and discussion, I think most people in our country have now seen, because they've seen these same-sex couples and their families, they now realize that's not true. And even people who, for religious reasons, and of course that's fine, still believe that marriage sacramentally should only be between a man or a woman, they're still able to see same-sex couples as fellow human beings. And I think that's just been a hugely healing, positive step for our country. And I think we're seeing a similar transformation now happen around transgender people. There's a lot of negative things happening to transgender people in this administration. Just yesterday, unfortunately, we lost the last injunction that was preventing President Trump from enforcing his new ban on transgender service members, and that's very unfortunate. But there is a silver lining here, because the thing before this whole controversy erupted, probably most people had no idea that transgender people are in the military. And I think probably a lot of people, if they thought about transgender people, they would have been likely to think of people who are like deviant or freakish or weird in their view. But now I think people are likely to think of people who are serving our country and who are dedicated and patriotic and actually fighting for the right to be able to serve. So I'm going to end there. I just want to thank every single one of you for being here today. And I want to say that I really believe that every time that any of you reach across lines of race or gender or politics or sexual orientation, gender identity, to try to really listen to somebody with openness and compassion, just don't ever doubt you're making a positive difference. And who knows? I mean, you might be planting seeds that will make a huge difference in someone's life down the road, and I know you're definitely making our country a better and a stronger place. Thanks very much.
You might have seen me watching my phone, but I'm watching you post to the Twitter stream, which I appreciate, pictures more than questions. So please, with the questions, we'd be grateful to have them because we will specifically respond to them during our discussion. And I just pulled out a check from the back of my phone. I'm writing somebody a check, some student a check for $250, I hope. So please, with the questions. So I'm Robin Wilson. Thank you first for being here. We're just really grateful. It's been a privilege for me to be working with Shannon in these dialogues across the country. Real privilege to do this with Jesse and with John. Case Western has always been a place where I've been, just delighted to be back and forth. I'm going to talk just about this topic, and you can see from this image that I think that the way the culture war has been running basically is a train wreck. Question is whether we could do something more constructive than that. And I want to talk about something that we talk about a lot in America, which is red and blue America, except I'm going to talk about it as sort of red and bumpy America. But we have sort of cross currents in the law. So in 21 states, there are protections for LGBT persons from being kicked out of their homes or fired from their jobs just for being who they are. Less states protect folks in public accommodations, like the restaurant. We went to Albatross last night. Amazing, by the way. You should go if you have the chance. But you could get kicked out of there for like being with the person you love. That seems messed up. I think most of us would think that's wrong. A lot of the country, sort of the flat parts on that map, that could happen. And I think lots of us really do believe that's wrong. Shannon talked about, what about the parts of the country that protect LGBT persons from discrimination in housing, hiring, and public accommodations? Now, how many of us have heard about the masterpiece, the Baker case? That's everybody here because we're all in law school, or most of us. By the way, how many of us are in law school? I'd be curious. And some of us not. Okay, cool. So, but the Baker case, was really unfortunate. One of the things that I show, and it was unfortunate because it didn't have to go that way. Like, this should be possible in the United States, both for LGBT persons to be protected and to be treated with respect at any business that's on Main Street, without the proprietor of that business feeling like they're going to lose their livelihood. Now, one of the reasons Masterpiece worked out the way that it did, and I show this in our book that John very helpfully flashed, but in that book I show that every single case that involved a photographer, a baker, a seamstress, every single one of them was resolved under a law that was written without marriage in mind. So the lawmakers actually didn't have an opportunity to try to think about how do we write a new script for sharing the public square where everybody's treated with respect. Everybody's in, as opposed to right now, this map is almost certain to stay static because many, many religious people believe the idea that if you protect LGBT people, they necessarily lose. It's actually not true. Those laws don't have to be written that way. So we had a book discussion yesterday about this book with lawmakers from Ohio. And it was, I think, really pretty compelling. These were lawmakers who were willing to stake their careers on the idea that we can write a script for a new public square that has everybody respected. And I'll just show you a little bit about Ohio because it's very germane here, I think. So you can't read this, but this is Senator Nikki Antonio's bill, where she's trying to protect the full LGBT community from discrimination. That's a great project, and it's the kind of, in fact, she is the person that the lawmakers yesterday were most involved with in having this exact discussion about finding a way to write a new script. That's important because Ohio, and I guess I didn't realize this until I pulled some stats the other day, Ohio is the 17th most religious state in America. I don't know why I didn't know that, think that. I didn't. I don't know. Many of you might, right? You may be from faith traditions. You also, if you look at the bottom map, which we riffed from the Movement Advancement Project, there are tons of LGBT folks living here too. So you right here, just on the demographics, there's a live challenge teed up. In fact, there are 443,000 LGBT persons in Ohio. And when the lawmakers who spoke yesterday fell short of being able to write that new script for political reasons, for timing reasons, that meant these 443,000 people, or some big fraction of them, are left without protections that they could have right now. That's, I just think, staggering and sad. A lot of your state already lives under a municipal SOGI, a sexual orientation, gender identity, non-discrimination law. So all those places that have like the red and the black dots, right? There's already a SOGI. What does that mean? That means for those very, very religious people, they already live in a place that hasn't left a tremendous amount of room for their needs in those local laws. And then everybody else lives in a part of the state that hasn't left any room for LGBT people. Seems sort of messed up. The municipal SOGIs, interestingly enough, I was just pulling this for something else I was doing. They all, to some degree, leave room for religion, but a very much a varying degree. So some of them will say, we're going to leave aside any religious corporation, which you can see there in violet. Other ones will say, you know, if there's a bona fide preference for a religious, a person working for your company who has a particular faith tradition, and if it's necessary and there's no less discriminatory means, then we will allow that in the employment non-discrimination law. Now, we might pick on whether those are exactly the right way to try to balance the interests of religious communities and persons with the interest of LGBT persons. But I think the clear takeaway from that is that the municipalities and local lawmakers in Ohio are engaged in that project. The question is, how do you do that at the state level? And how do you create uniformity? Because you have businesses operating all across Ohio that are actually having to navigate dramatically different laws, right? Not least of which is lots of them work in places that have no protection for LGBT persons at all. And then they're in places that had those. So it's a difficult problem. This I'll skip over because I'm very interested to hear Emma and Kyle, so I don't want to monopolize. But there are different things that are at stake. You know, what do you do about not the church qua church, because that's always going to be protected. No one's going to make you marry folks, you know, in the sanctuary that you don't want to marry. That's just the First Amendment. Even First Amendment scholars, who I think, Jesse, don't agree on almost anything, agree on that. Okay? It's everything that happens when you move out from there. Religiously affiliated social services. Religious universities, which, by the way, are 1 in 4 in America. Can they have married student housing that follows their faith traditions around family? That's a hard question. New York, when it passed its marriage equality law, said yes to that, right? Because it just seemed like the university ought to be able to, you know, contour what's happening within the university. We may fault that, but those are some of the questions that would be at stake. And then, as John said, we sort of talk about them in this book. So if you're interested in a deeper dive, you know, that's one place to start. But I think one thing that's absolutely crucial is that we try to take the venom and the heat out of these discussions and try seriously to see what each person needs, and then write a law that does that. Seems easy enough, doesn't it?
Hello. I am not a law student, so I'm going to keep this short and simple. I wanted to make a short point different from the essay that I wrote. I just wanted to say that tolerance also starts with the self, and it's a never-ending process that I think we humans will be fighting over as long as we are here on Earth, and it's a never-ending process within myself because I'm constantly trying to be a better person and a more accepting person, but you know, like the fact that I am a gay art student, you would think that, I'd have very set liberal views, which I used to, but, I'm trying to branch out from that, especially being here today and hearing Robin and Shannon talk. It's scary to reveal yourself and open your mind to foreign ideas. It's a risk. It takes bravery on some level to be tolerant. The word itself can be applied to many different situations, but I think that the tolerance that I specifically was writing about, and I am still trying to make sense of, and will always hopefully try, it's a little bigger than that. I think it takes a lot of courage to accept the beliefs of people around you and try to understand them, and really all we need to do is listen and be kind to each other. That's all. Thank you.
So, tolerance is a word we often throw out in response to adverse values, kind of under the pretense that, just demanding silent acceptance of something is going to make that controversy go away. When in reality, the culture war that was mentioned earlier, when that culture war comes in and kind of forces us to hide that disagreement, it's telling of a fundamental misunderstanding of what tolerance truly requires. And I've seen this on a pretty daily basis as a gay person from a very Roman Catholic family, because on the one hand you have religious and moral objectors to homosexuality who oftentimes lack the life experiences that might enable them to empathize or even sympathize, in some cases, with a gay person. And on the other hand, you have the gay community that's fighting for equal treatment before the law, but often they'll get so caught up in that they forget to try to understand what the base reason is for those moral objections that a lot of that community has. And that's just one example in our society of a really major issue that we don't see a whole lot of deep dialogue between the two parties, because we have this kind of mentality that we can't meet in the middle. We see this all the time in politics, where one politician tries to cross the line and go talk to the other person. Just that discussion is oftentimes criticized in the media. And a lot of us, when we think of the word tolerance, we think it's our ability to endure something without displaying an adverse reaction. And that's not fundamentally wrong, but we're also undermining our efforts at tolerance when we make it the end rather than the means for social progress. The example I always like to use is that of sibling feuds. Who here has siblings? Okay, that's a lot of you. Who has ever done something mean to their sibling? All right, also most of you. If you didn't put your hand up, I'm going to question that. But so if you were like my family, if you did something mean, your brother would run, you'd tell your parents would come and tell you to apologize. Okay, was it just saying sorry that gave your apology meaning? No, of course not, because if you were like me, you're standing there in front of your brother, you're like, I'm sorry. You don't look sorry, you don't sound sorry, okay? Your parents weren't telling you to say those words just because the words themselves have some magical meaning that makes everything better. They were telling you to say it because they were trying to teach you to feel something inside yourself when you say those words. They're trying to teach you regret about what you did. And similarly, the purpose of tolerance isn't to maintain our society in kind of the perpetual feuding families Thanksgiving dinner where there's disagreement at the table. Everyone knows there's disagreement at the table, but grandma wants that perfect Thanksgiving dinner, so we're not going to talk about it. Okay? The point of tolerance is to, first of all, get us to the position where we can actually have that conversation. Because if you can't hear a differing opinion without, having an explosive reaction, you're never going to have a productive dialogue. But it's not just having that conversation. It's about being able to have that conversation with the purpose of reaching a common understanding. And that common understanding doesn't require you to agree on everything, or even anything. It doesn't require you to adopt the political, moral, ethical, social values of your ideological opponent. What it does require is moving past merely recognizing that, there is a differing opinion out there towards trying to understand what that opinion is, why that person holds it, and most importantly, what you can try to do to reach a common understanding about that point. And it's unfortunate that in today's society, we're kind of encouraged to believe in a false dichotomy of you're on one side or the other of an issue and there's no middle ground. I mean, we see this in politics all the time where you're either Democrat, you're encouraged to be Republican, and if you're an independent, well, you don't matter, okay? Which isn't the case. You're entitled to have differing opinion. You're entitled to be able to come together on issues. And so what I would encourage all of you to do is the next time you hear someone say something where your gut reaction is, oh my goodness, that's completely wrong, instead of going up to the person and just telling them why they're wrong, ask them why they're right. And a lot of the time, you're going to, first of all, start a conversation, but you're also going to oftentimes get an answer that's really surprising. Thank you.
You want to take questions, John? Yeah, I have some on Twitter, but let's start with the folks here, and then I'll read a couple.
So, I'm curious what any of the panelists think about our notion of tolerance. In some respects, comes out of a tradition of religious toleration that arose at a time when far more people participated in faith traditions than do today. And so there was a broader cultural understanding of what it meant to be committed to a faith tradition and to be bound by the obligations that faith imposes, as well as a recognition that those who reject one's faith tradition, by some accounts, are threatening very severe consequences, not only to themselves and their own immortal soul, but perhaps those to others, right? That heresy and the like, treated the way they were because they were threats to people's salvation. And I'm just wondering if maybe you have thoughts about how we translate the notion of tolerance that arose in that sort of context to a contemporary context where for a large percentage of people, the underlying commitments aren't faith-based in a religious sense, but are either different conceptions of identity, non-faith-based conceptions of identity, or political commitments. And does that change the way we should think about what tolerance means and how it should apply?
Well, just super quickly. No, that's really interesting thing about that history. But yeah, I think now we can appeal to hopefully everyone's belief, which can be perfectly secular, as well as having a faith-based component for some people, in democracy. I mean, if we really believe in democracy, and I think we do, then we believe that everyone has an equal right to participate and contribute, and that their views should be taken into consideration. And if we're really going to write off people who hold certain views as beyond the pale and not, somebody that we need to include in our world of political discourse, that is like fundamentally anti-democratic. And I think that's a really powerful reminder that I wish more people would remember on both the left and the right.
I want to make sure that Kyle and Emma, if you have anything to add, think. Okay, but let me just say a little bit. So look, I think that's right, John, that maybe we had more respect for religious minorities because many people in the country had a religion. But I don't think that the kinds of religious liberty protections that have been there since our founding were majoritarian. They were anti-majoritarian. So think about a Quaker who can't swear an oath. Sometimes we had oath, and different religious tests in state constitutions. They ultimately get dropped over time out of respect for the fact that religious minorities were part of our social fabric. And there was no justification for asking them to swear an oath if they could not. So I think that's long been in our tradition. What's surprising and different now, I think, is that lots of people who had that prized status, the privileged status of being the majority, find that they're not the only one in town. and that we need to try to balance protections now for them, who I think many of them feel that they're the minority. They may not be statistically, but they certainly feel that they are. And to some extent, in that sort of newly found minority status, they're making parallel claims to other folks. So LGBT folks are saying, look, I want to be fully authentically myself in private, but in public. I don't want to be kicked out of a housing unit. I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to get married on Sunday and be fired on Monday. It's not right. And religious folks are trying to make a similar kind of claim. They're saying that my faith is so integral to myself that I want to be who I am in public and in private as well. So I think that's actually some of the purchase. The fact that maybe we think we're having more of these conversations because people's prior privileged statuses have been thrown into question. But I think the questions that each of them bring to bear are strikingly, dramatically the same.
And then with specific regards to the changing religious trends in the country, I think one of the problems is that as people become less familiar with a lot of the ideological points within the churches, at least from a specific perspective of being familiar with the Catholic Church, there's various theological reasons that they have that they use to justify their position on homosexuality. And because, first of all, they don't do a great job of expressing that to the mainstream of what the specific reasons are, and because a lot of the main public no longer is familiar with a lot of those reasons, there's not a whole lot of discussion that might actually lead to changing the perspective of the church as a whole, or at least resulting in greater education about what those reasons are. And so I think the first thing that has to happen is trying to understand those reasons on both sides of the aisle, so that you can actually discuss the main issue that you want to talk about.
Other questions? We'll turn to the Twitter page.
I want to follow up on the point that you brought up about balancing protections for both sides of the coin, and how without exempting individuals or organizations from some of like the legislation and organizational policies, or punishing violators of those new laws, new bills that don't wish to conform, what are the avenues for common ground between the two groups when they have such competing differences and rights?
Okay, can I give you two examples? So Jesse may remember this, but in Title VII, which is our federal employment non-discrimination law, so put aside sexual orientation and gender identity for a second, there's an exemption for religious employers and religious organizations and religious universities. And they can hire according to their faith, right? They're not categorically set aside, but if somebody makes a religious discrimination claim against them, they have a defense, okay? Now that sort of intuitively makes sense for a second, right? So the Archdiocese of Philadelphia probably needs to be led by a Catholic. I mean, I don't see whole lots of people who have a huge issue with that. Sometimes the structure of the law leads us to believe that we have given religious people a pass. How many people have heard religious people have gotten a pass since Hobby Lobby? Like, how about license to discriminate? Come on, hands up. That's everybody, right? But if you think about it, why was that exemption in the law in Title VII? It was there because Congress was saying to the American people, it's illegitimate not to hire a person, generally, if you're Walmart, or UPS, for their religious faith. And so they were taking from sort of the ability of groups to self-define one important thing. We're not going to treat people differently based on race, national origin, religion, and so forth. Now think for a second the Sierra Club. I think we can all agree that the Sierra Club should not be led by a climate denier, right? How dumb is that? We can get behind this idea. But that wasn't taken from people in Title VII. Like, we don't have a cannot refuse to hire the climate denier rule. So in effect, the Sierra Club's here. It can self-define. And when you took the ability to religiously discriminate away from everybody at the get-go in Title VII, you were messing with the ability of religious people to be able to self-define too. So then you have to carve them out and put them sort of back. Now that's, you know, we go and look at that and we go, look, see, they exempted the religious people. That's kind of wrong. Some of us might say because they were in the majority, right? They had super good lobbyists. But I think that actually misunderstands the project. They were really being put back to where the Sierra Club is right now. So I think one thing is just, again, take the venom and the heat out of this. Put, you know, this room is filled mostly with lawyers. That's what lawyers do. It's actually the very constructive thing that we do. I think that's useful. I think the other way to try to do this is to be smarter about the way we write these rules. So when we wrote all of those sexual orientation, gender identity, non-discrimination laws in America, we did not have marriage in mind. Not a single one of them has been written after marriage equality came on the scene, which tees up a different set of issues. So yesterday we had a discussion with Ohio lawmakers, and Ohio had one specific question among a whole set that they needed to resolve. And that is what would happen with judges who in Ohio, after Obergefell and after the preceding decision, but let's squish them together for the moment, after marriage equality, felt like they couldn't do that. They couldn't marry gay folks. Now, some of these judges had said they would be willing not to marry anybody. They just wanted out of that because it was a discretionary part of their job. It wasn't central. It's not what they were hired for. But Ohio law had provisions in place that were written, no lie, 150 years ago, that were unclear about whether some judges had a duty to marry folks or not, whether it was even part of their job. There were 4 different court systems that had people who could possibly do the solemnization function. Of those laws over the 4 court systems, the most recent was from the 1950s. It wasn't written with this problem in mind either. And then there was just a hot mess because the only one of those 4 judicial systems that actually had anything that approached a mandatory duty, the word shall, only covered 44 of 88 counties in Ohio. So already, gay, straight, black, white, purple, there was an access issue. It wasn't about gay folks necessarily. It might disproportionately impact them. It's true, but it wasn't just about them. So the lawmakers that I worked with went to town and they said, how can we revise that to be fairer? And their thought was to place a duty on the system, the court system that had judges in all 88 counties. It also had the benefit of having lots and lots of employees in those probate court offices, which would have meant that almost certainly no one would have been fired if they felt that they couldn't do this. And then they just made a duty, or the plan would have been to have a duty on the clerk of the court to name whoever it was that was going to fulfill this duty for the state. And then those people or person would have to be available to every person, right? Whether they were, gay, straight, or otherwise, on exactly the same basis. Now that's just, it seemed that, you could just ignore LGBT stuff. That seems to me wise policy in Ohio. It doesn't have anything to do with gay folks, right? And maybe if we exploit more of those creative solutions, I think we'll be in better shape. Want some Twitter questions? I do, actually. Okay, I wrote them down just so I don't have to read from my phone. So one of them, actually was really interesting, is what can we as legal professionals do to promote tolerance? I thought that was a great question. You take it.
Oh, well, no, I do. I do love that question very much. And I actually think that we have an obligation, a professional responsibility as lawyers to model, not just civility, but tolerance. And I really, Eric, I love the way you frame tolerance as is a means, not an end. The end is not to be tolerant of each other, but the goal is to be able to have substantive conversations where we actually take into consideration the other person's point of view. So I do think, especially since our society is so, the law plays such a huge, has such a huge social impact, and lawyers, for better or worse, are often like the lead advocates for the LGBT movement and other movements and have kind of an outsized influence that way. I do think it would be really important, and I would love to see that happen, for lawyers to be the first ones out there instead of constantly seeking how to escalate conflict or deepen it, but to really think creatively along the lines that Robin was just suggesting. What's so frustrating to me, and I definitely took the point of your question, is it can seem at first glance that these are intractable problems, but I've been really quite amazed that when you dig into the specifics and really understand what are the very specific interests that faith communities, religious folks are concerned about, then what are the equality goals that the advocates are trying to accomplish, there's actually not that much conflict. It's just a few issues that come up. Some of them are much more difficult than others, but most of them, with some creativity and accommodation, really are not that daunting. And I love the judge example. That's the perfect example. No one harmed, non-discriminatory, everyone served. But if we put, there's a lot of, brain power, legal brain power in the LGBT movement, and if we were using more of that brain power to come up with creative solutions and less of it to just, fend off any possible discussion about the possibility of creative solutions, I just think we could make so much progress. And Robin, you didn't make this point today, I don't think, but you did yesterday. It's been 10 years since we passed the comprehensive anti-discrimination law at the state level for LGBT people. Like, we need to make some progress. And the only way to make progress is to come at this with a more positive, creative, flexible, accommodating perspective.
Yeah, one point on that, and I'm going to keep taking questions and read some from here too. But one point on that is, look, the last non-discrimination, full LGBT non-discrimination law in America was Colorado's. And many of you will remember it's 2007, and that was the rise of the bathroom narrative, which is one of the most destructive things, I think, has been sort of the quote, safety claims that have been made about trans folks is one of the most destructive things I think that we've engaged in as an American public. And if you want to read, the substance of the claim that I just made, go read my paper called The Nonsense About Bathrooms, and it deconstructs those safety claims. So we had questions here, yeah.
I just wanted to combine the last two questions and ask my question, trying to think of ways to come up with compromises that might work, and the question about the legal profession, the ABA most recently amended model rules, and model rule 24 now has a provision prohibiting discrimination by attorneys. That's received blowback from the religious right, and trying to figure out how there can be some kind of accommodation tolerating a view that says we should have a non-discrimination provision in our legal ethics rules.
That appears to be for me. Okay. Well, I don't know. Do you have Kyle, you're going to be taking have you had PR yet? Not going to put you on the spot. You haven't had it yet. Okay. Yeah. Well, look, so it's a tough question, and I was talking with George Dent about it yesterday, so I need to think a lot more about it. But I will say this. So go back to the judges, for example, because it's instructive. Yesterday at our book dialogue, one of the case faculty had a very strong negative reaction to the idea that you would try to solve the judge's problem. Why? Because how could any judge be allowed to discriminate? Okay, pause for a second. When those state lawmakers write a rule that tries to be sort of this new script, they're taking people as they find them. And many of those folks have been in those positions long before there was marriage equality. And there was uncertainty in the background law of the state that they inherit along with everybody else. And we're all just stuck going, what's anybody supposed to do? And these clashes just erupt. If they take those folks out of the conflict, They should not do so at the expense of people being treated differently. You should never be walking up to a state office and told you are less than, period. So the question is, start with that principle and then ask yourself, is it possible for the folks who found themselves in this system to do the things that they are primarily there for, right? In fact, if you think about it, the project of those lawmakers was to define the job. That's actually what they were doing because it hadn't been defined for 150 years. And they had a reason to do that. And I think if they can find a way both to define the job so that the folks who want to do this are able to do it on a completely equal opportunity basis, same way for everybody, that's to the good. Now, the ABA rule is tough because I think you have to think about the ways in which attorneys, I'd have to think about the ways in which people present to those attorneys, right? So, I do family law, for example. Family law is fraught with all kinds of hard stuff. But bankruptcy, I don't know, anybody here want to be a bankruptcy lawyer? So I don't want to offend you. But like, you couldn't pay me enough money to do that. And beyond, I don't really see how like serving one person for bankruptcy or another person for bankruptcy implicates any religious view at all, right? So I just have to think harder about it. But I think it will be front and center. And it will be something where, you know, you're going to have a lot of angst about it. And so I think, you know, the law students here can contribute to trying to sort out how that should work. Hugh?
So to shift gears slightly, I agree with the general idea that we dialogue, we talk, we come together as we're doing today. That's hopefully going to help move the football, in one direction or the other. But my question is, there seems to be, or how do we overcome this presumption of bad faith that seems to pervade these dialogues, not these dialogues obviously, but this dialogue, right? I mean, I come from, my background before I came to law school is as a moral theologian. So I come from a very particular view. I come from, I've seen, there's an example, right? Church adoption agencies being told, because you don't place, because you refuse to, to place children with a same-sex couple, you are no longer welcome to be. And there was definitely dialogue that occurred in those situations. But there's this, this idea of one of my least favorite phrases, being on the wrong side of history, right? There's the presumption that if we disagree, that is somehow, my reasons for believing that it really is okay for a Catholic adoption agency not to place children with same-sex parents, despite the fact that I have no issue with that, but that the church has thought about that and has a good faith reason and is acting in good faith. So how do we overcome that presumption?
Yeah, I think we can. Actually, can I announce the winner? And then we talk about this for just a second. I want to tell you about something I'm trying to do, Hugh, on exactly this question. But is Vito in the room? Vito? Dude, good, great question. Will you see me so I can, at the end, we'll wrap up in just a second. But come see me, okay? So, but look, Hugh, I think, so this is my passion, okay? And I'm going to tell you why. I'm adopted, okay? My parents adopted me in Virginia. My dad grew up in Appalachia. He had a 3rd grade education. Went in the military, changed his whole life. I'm only telling you that because for my dad to try to adopt in like the 60s kids, it was a huge thing for him. Because people didn't talk about infertility then. We didn't do open adoptions and stuff like that. Like, you adopted kids and then you went on as a natural family. You even think about the language, right? Now, if my parents had walked up to an adoption agency and had been told that they were less than, my dad would have turned to my mom and said, we are out of here. And that's it. And Robin and April would not have been adopted. Period. If you look at who is adopting in the United States, it's single women, it's gay couples, and it's religious people. That's who's taking care of our children right now. And there is a gargantuan need in America. There are 406,000 children like me, right? So we've got to do something. Now look at the other side of the ledger. In some of our states, 25% of the entire load is being borne by religious adoption agencies. It turns out that they have a really good ability to pull people forward, okay? And then, and you can go look at some talks I've done, I'll send them to you at Cato and other places, but look, there's a whole continuum of how we pay for a kid who gets fostered. I was fostered before I was adopted. And basically, it's an antiquated system that has favored large monopolists. So, you know, you have to identify a family, you have to train a family, got to get them to want to adopt, you have to home study the family, you have to certify that family, and then everybody sits around until there's a rupture in the middle of the night and a kid has to be placed. And then the agency calls that family, and finally there's a placement, and the kid's monitored in that placement, not released to be adopted for 22 months under federal law, right? And you know when the first payment hits? When that kid gets to a family. Now, what does that mean? That means that we have favored large adoption agencies that can carry that basket of risk for these kids. And the only things where there's, at least if you listen to some of the Catholics, not all of them, the problems are up in those early steps. So I've been going with other people to agencies, to federal regulators, to state lawmakers, and saying, well, just take off the early steps. Take off the payment for the early steps. You will draw more people into the market. You won't have so many people who don't want to do something or will tell someone there's less than. And we do this with early childhood development, in fact. You know that? So in America, if you qualify as a poorer family, you can get a certificate, which you can spend for early childhood development for your kid, you know, daycare. And you could spend it at the Lutheran school, you can spend it at the Montessori, you can spend it with grandma, right? And I think one of the things that has bedeviled us in adoption is this antiquated funding system where all the dollars follow the child. And maybe this is me just because of, you know, my parents, but I think, damn it, it was my parents who made this commitment. It should be my parents who decide, if I'm going to adopt, these are the folks, or if I'm going to foster, these are the folks that are going to help me. And that means the state needs to run a whole lot more interference than it's done in the past, instead of just sort of sitting back and waiting for all these clashes. So I think part of the goodwill, the vacuum that we have, comes from a lack of imagination. And I actually think that's why what Emma and Kyle have done is so remarkable. Because they're sitting here struggling with, how do we make it work? Same question you asked, right? Anyway, I think it's terrific. Thank you guys for having us, and we just really appreciate the privilege of being with you. Your law review article, I'm sure you'll be on law review about that question, because that will be like the question, man.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Vito, what's your last name, man? So Oxford, oh, Michigan.